March 8, 1943, Abbeville-Dreux Airfield, northern France. The Messerschmitt Bf-109G sat on the hardstand with its engine cowling removed, exposing the Daimler-Benz inverted V12 that had powered Germany's most famous fighter through 3 years of air superiority. Oberleutnant Klaus Becker ran his hand along the engine's cooling fins, still warm from the morning patrol, feeling the precision engineering that represented everything German aviation had achieved since the days of Richthofen and Judith. The metallic smell of aviation fuel mixed with gun oil hung in the cold March air, and from the operations tent came the steady chatter of radio communications tracking the bomber formations assembling over England. Another mission was forming up, another maximum effort by the American 8th Air Force, another opportunity to demonstrate that German fighters still ruled the skies over the Reich. Becker had flown 43 combat missions since transferring to JG-26 in December 1942, accumulating 11 confirmed victories against RAF Spitfires and American B-17s. His tactics refined through months of combat into instinctive precision. He understood his aircraft intimately, knew exactly how much punishment his 109 could absorb, trusted the armor plate behind his seat and the firepower of his 20mm cannon and machine guns. The Americans were coming in greater numbers each month, but their escort fighters could only penetrate so far inland before fuel considerations forced them to turn back, leaving the bombers vulnerable to concentrated attack. The mathematics of aerial combat seemed to favor the defenders, and every pilot at Abbeville believed that spring would bring the breaking point when American losses would become unsustainable. The sound reached them before the visual identification was possible: a deep, rumbling thunder that was wrong somehow, too heavy, too powerful, distinctly different from the high-pitched whine of Merlin engines that powered Spitfires, or the throaty roar of Allison engines in P-38 Lightnings. Becker looked up, scanning the western sky where clouds were breaking apart under morning sun, and saw them 8 aircraft flying in a loose formation at perhaps 20,000 feet, their silhouettes unmistakable even at distance. They were enormous for single-engine fighters, with broad wings and massive fuselages that seemed too bulky for aggressive maneuvering, painted in the olive drab and gray camouflage that marked all American aircraft. But what struck Becker immediately was their altitude. The Americans had never brought escort fighters this far inland before, and these aircraft were flying at heights where only dedicated interceptors normally operated. The P-47 Thunderbolts, making their combat debut over occupied Europe, were about to demonstrate that every German assumption about escort fighter capabilities was obsolete. That American engineering had created a fighter that combined range, altitude, performance, firepower, and survivability in ways that would transform the air war completely. The Thunderbolt's development had been almost accidental, emerging not from deliberate strategic planning, but from the intersection of American engineering philosophy with European combat experience filtered through imperfect intelligence reports. The aircraft's manufacturer, Republic Aviation, had been building fighters for the Army Air Corps since the late 1930s, producing the P-35 and P-43 series that represented competent but unspectacular designs suitable for peacetime training and homeland defense. When war erupted in Europe in September 1939, American military attaches sent urgent reports describing aerial combat between German and Allied fighters, emphasizing the importance of speed, climb rate, firepower, and especially altitude performance. The Luftwaffe's Bf-109E dominated early combat, partially through superior tactics but also through engine performance that gave German fighters advantages at altitudes where British aircraft struggled. The reports reaching Washington described air battles fought at 20,000 feet and higher, where thin air reduced engine power and control surface effectiveness, where only aircraft designed specifically for high altitude operations could compete effectively. Republic Aviation's chief designer, Alexander K. studied these reports with the understanding that European combat experience was providing free intelligence that American designers would be foolish to ignore. The lesson he extracted was brutally simple. The next generation of American fighters needed to operate effectively at altitudes where current designs suffocated, and this required massive engines producing horsepower that would have seemed excessive for fighters designed to earlier specifications. Cartvelli's proposal, submitted to the Army Air Corps in June 1940, called for a fighter built around the Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp radial engine, an 18-cylinder power plant producing 2,000 horsepower, that had been developed for bombers and commercial aircraft but never applied to fighters. The engine alone weighed over 2,000 pounds, more than entire fighters from the previous generation, and building an airframe around it would require accepting weight penalties that contradicted every conventional principle of fighter design. The prototype, XP-47B, that first flew on May 6, 1941, was a shock to Army Air Corps observers who had expected something resembling enlarged versions of existing fighters. Instead, they confronted an aircraft that weighed over 12,000 pounds fully loaded, making it heavier than many twin-engine aircraft and more than double the weight of the Bf-109s it would eventually face in combat. The fuselage was enormous, necessary to accommodate the massive engine and the turbocharger installation that would enable high-altitude performance. The wings were thick and broad, providing the lift necessary to get such mass airborne and the structural strength to survive high-speed maneuvers. The cockpit sat far aft, perched atop the fuselage like an afterthought, giving pilots visibility that was adequate rather than excellent. Everything about the design screamed excess, violated conventional wisdom about fighter characteristics, and suggested that Republic had fundamentally misunderstood what air combat required. The test pilots who flew early prototypes reported that the aircraft felt more like piloting a locomotive than a fighter, massive and powerful but lacking the delicate responsiveness that characterized successful pursuit planes. What the skeptics missed, and what would only become apparent in combat, was that Kartveli had designed the Thunderbolt for a kind of air warfare that did not yet exist in 1941 but would dominate by 1943. The conventional fighter doctrine emphasized dogfitting, tight-turning combat where superior maneuverability allowed pilots to position their aircraft behind opponents for killing shots. This doctrine had emerged from First World War combat and had been reinforced by Spanish Civil War and early Second World War experience where victories generally went to pilots who could outturn their opponents. The Thunderbolt could not dogfight effectively. Its massive weight and high wing loading made it sluggish in turns, and pilots who tried to engage enemy fighters in traditional swirling combat found themselves outmaneuvered and vulnerable. But the Thunderbolt excelled at a different combat methodology that American pilots would term boom and zoom, diving from superior altitude, making a single high-speed firing pass, then using speed and momentum to climb back to altitude before the enemy could respond. This tactic exploited the Thunderbolt's genuine advantages: speed and dives, stability as a gun platform, ability to absorb punishment, and perhaps most importantly, engine performance that allowed sustained operations at altitudes where German fighters struggled. The R2800 engine's turbo was the key technology that made high-altitude performance possible. Unlike mechanically driven superchargers that drew power directly from the engine, the turbocharger used exhaust gases to spin a turbine that compressed incoming air, effectively maintaining sea-level air density even at 30,000 feet. This system was complex, temperamental, and added significant weight to the aircraft, but it delivered performance that no other single-engine fighter could match at extreme altitudes, where a Bf-109G's engine produced 1,400 horsepower at sea level, but only 800 horsepower at 30,000 feet. The Thunderbolt's turbocharged engine maintained nearly full power regardless of altitude. This meant that at 25,000 feet and above, the Thunderbolt was actually faster and more powerful than German fighters designed to be superior performers at lower altitudes. The Americans had accidentally created a high-altitude interceptor that could also serve as a long-range escort fighter, bomber, destroyer, and eventually ground attack aircraft, though none of these roles were originally intended in the design specifications. The Thunderbolt's armament represented another expression of American engineering philosophy that emphasized overwhelming firepower over precision or elegance, where most fighters carried 4 or 6 machine guns firing rifle-caliber ammunition. The P-47 mounted 8 Browning M2.50 caliber heavy machine guns, 4 in each wing, with ammunition loads approaching 3,000 rounds total. The .50 caliber was an unusual choice for fighter armament. European air forces generally used smaller, faster-firing rifle-caliber guns or larger 20mm cannons, considering the .50 caliber too heavy and slow-firing for effective air combat. but the Americans had experience with the .50 caliber from bomber defensive armament, understood its ballistics intimately, and recognized advantages that European designers dismissed. The heavy bullet retained velocity and energy at long range better than lighter rifle caliber rounds, making it effective at distances where smaller guns lost penetrating power. The ammunition was more reliable than cannon shells, with lower malfunction rates and better storage characteristics. And critically, the .50 caliber could destroy aircraft, vehicles, locomotives, and fortified positions with equal effectiveness, making it suitable for both air-to-air and air-to-ground employment. When all 8 guns fired simultaneously, the Thunderbolt delivered approximately 100 pounds of projectiles per second into its target, a rate of fire that could literally saw aircraft in half or shred armored vehicles with sustained bursts. Pilots described the experience as riding a jackhammer. The recoil from 8 heavy machine guns, producing vibrations that shook the entire airframe and slowed the aircraft noticeably during firing passes. Gun camera footage from Thunderbolt attacks shows the devastating effect of concentrated .50 caliber fire, bombers disintegrating under impacts from dozens of armor-piercing incendiary rounds, fighters exploding when hits penetrated fuel tanks or ammunition storage, ground targets erupting in flame as tracers ignited fuel and munitions. The sheer violence of the Thunderbolt's armament shocked pilots on both sides, accustomed to combat where multiple firing passes were necessary to destroy a target. A Thunderbolt needed only seconds on target to inflict catastrophic damage, assuming the pilot could hold the aircraft steady against the recoil and accurately judge deflection for a moving target. The first P-47S arrived in England in December 1942, assigned to the 56th Fighter Group based at Horsham St. Faith and the 78th Fighter Group at Duxford. American pilots transitioning from P-40 Warhawks and P-39 Arucabros to the massive Thunderbolts were simultaneously impressed and intimidated by the new aircraft. Colonel Hubert Zemke, commander of the 56th Fighter Group and one of the most experienced fighter pilots in the Army Air Forces, wrote in his diary after his first Thunderbolt flight, "This airplane is an absolute monster. It flies like a pregnant elephant, turns like an aircraft carrier, and requires a runway approximately the length of Pennsylvania to take off fully loaded, but climb to 25,000 feet, open the throttle, and suddenly you're riding a 470-mile-per-hour rocket that accelerates like nothing else in the sky." The Germans are going to be very surprised when they discover that this elephant can run faster than their racehorses. The surprise came on March 8, 1943, when P-47s flew their first combat mission, escorting B-17 bombers attacking rail yards at Rouen, France. German fighter controllers, tracking the incoming formations on radar and plotting intercept vectors for their defending fighters, initially dismissed the P-47s as probable B-17 stragglers flying protective formation. The assumption was reasonable. No single-engined fighter had ever penetrated this far inland with sufficient fuel remaining for combat and returned to England. When Klaus Becker and his squadron mates from JG-26 tried to intercept what they believed was a vulnerable bomber formation, they expected routine combat following familiar patterns, high-speed diving attacks through the escort screen, then sustained engagement with the bombers themselves, relying on armor and cannon firepower to survive defensive fire while destroying the unescorted fortresses. What they encountered instead were enemy fighters at 28,000 feet, positioned ideally above the bombers they were escorting, clearly prepared for combat rather than desperately trying to return to England before fuel exhaustion. The engagement lasted approximately 11 minutes, and while neither side suffered losses, the Germans were too cautious to press attacks against unexpectedly capable escorts. The Americans too inexperienced to effectively pursue. Retreating 109s, the psychological impact was immediate and profound. Becker recorded in his combat report that evening, "The new American fighter is unlike anything we have encountered. It cannot turn with a 109, but it need not turn. It attacks from above, diving at tremendous speed, fires devastating burst, then zooms back to altitude before we can react. Our standard tactic of hard turning to evade pursuit is completely ineffective because these aircraft do not pursue. They simply climb away and position for another attack. We destroyed no bombers today because we were entirely occupied with defensive maneuvering against escorts that should not have been present at all. If the Americans can provide this level of escort throughout our defensive zone, the bomber offensive becomes much more dangerous than previous calculations suggested. The German fighter force that confronted the Thunderbolts in spring 1943 was the most experienced and capable air combat organization in the world, having accumulated nearly 4 years of continuous combat experience across Poland, France, Britain, Russia, and the Mediterranean. The pilots of JG-2, JG-26, JG-1, and other fighter wings defending the Reich were not novices, but veterans with dozens or hundreds of missions. Survivors of brutal attrition who understood aerial combat with hard-won expertise. Their aircraft, while older in basic design than the Thunderbolt, had been continuously refined through combat experience, improved engines, better armament, enhanced armor protection, streamlined production techniques that allowed rapid replacement of losses. The Bf-109G that entered service in 1942 was substantially superior to the Bf-109E that had fought the Battle of Britain, and the Focke-Wulf FW-190A, introduced in 1941, was arguably the finest all-around fighter aircraft operational in 1943. German pilots expected tactical surprise occasionally, but they did not expect strategic emergence of an entirely new class of American fighter that could contest German air superiority over the Reich itself. Yet that was precisely what the Thunderbolt represented, not merely an improved fighter, but a revolutionary weapons system that changed the fundamental parameters of air warfare over Europe. The maximum combat radius of previous escort fighters, Spitfires and P-38 Lightnings, had limited bomber penetration to targets within approximately 175 miles of English bases. Beyond that distance, the bombers flew unescorted, vulnerable to concentrated fighter attack, suffering losses that by late 1943 approached 15 to 20% on some missions. The P-47, equipped with external drop tanks, developed during 1943, could escort bombers to targets 230 miles from base, later extended to over 300 miles as larger tanks became available. This increased escort radius meant that German fighters, which had previously concentrated their attacks in the unescorted zone deep inside German airspace, now faced American fighters throughout most of the bomber's route. The safe attacking zone contracted from hundreds of miles to a narrow corridor that was increasingly untenable as American fighter strength grew. The transformation of the Thunderbolt from a pure air superiority fighter to a multi-role aircraft capable of ground attack was accidental, emerging from tactical developments rather than deliberate planning. In July 1943, during an escort mission where no German fighters appeared, Major Gerald Johnson of the 56th Fighter Group experimented with strafing a German airfield rather than returning to England with full ammunition loads. The attack destroyed 3 parked aircraft and damaged several more, demonstrating that the Thunderbolt's 8.50 caliber guns were devastatingly effective against ground targets. Within weeks, fighter groups throughout the 8th Air Force were incorporating ground attack into their standard operating procedures, strafing airfields, rail lines, vehicles, and anything else that presented itself as a target of opportunity. The tactic was dangerous, low and slow, made fighters vulnerable to light, anti-aircraft fire that could be ignored at altitude. The results were spectacular enough that losses seemed acceptable. By autumn 1943, the Thunderbolt had evolved from escort fighter to hunter-killer, with some aircraft assigned exclusively to ground attack, while others maintained protective altitude for the bombers. The typical mission profile involved climbing to maximum altitude while crossing the English Channel, rendezvousing with bomber formations over France, escorting the bombers to their target while engaging any German fighters that attempted interception, then descending to low altitude after the bombers turned for home and hunting ground targets across occupied Europe. German military traffic, which had moved relatively freely during daylight hours in early 1943, it became increasingly dangerous by late 1943 as marauding Thunderbolts attacked trains, truck convoys, barges, and anything else that moved. The psychological impact was profound. German soldiers learned to freeze when aircraft appeared, rather than continuing movement that would attract attention, disrupting logistics and movement schedules throughout the occupied territories. The Thunderbolt's ability to absorb punishment became legendary among pilots on both sides, transforming American tactical calculations and German strategic assumptions about fighter vulnerability. The aircraft's radial engine, with 18 cylinders arranged in 2 rows around a central crankshaft, could continue running even when several cylinders were destroyed by enemy fire. The cockpit was protected by thick armor plate and bulletproof glass that could stop 20mm cannon shells at all but point-blank range. The airframe's rugged construction meant that structural damage that would doom lighter fighters merely degraded Thunderbolt performance without causing immediate catastrophic failure. Pilots routinely returned to base with hundreds of bullet holes in their aircraft, control surfaces shredded, hydraulic systems shot away, yet still able to fly well enough to reach Stoke, England, and execute controlled landings. Captain Robert Johnson of the 56th Fighter Group survived an encounter on June 26, 1943, that became emblematic of the Thunderbolt's survivability. During a bomber escort mission, his P-47 was hit by cannon fire from an FW-190, damaging his engine and rendering his radio and guns inoperative. A German pilot positioned behind Johnson fired repeated bursts into the Thunderbolt at close range, hitting the aircraft more than 200 times, destroying the tail section, punching holes through both wings, and shattering the canopy around Johnson's head. Yet the Thunderbolt continued flying, and Johnson successfully evaded further attacks by diving to ground level and flying at maximum speed across France to the English Channel. He crash-landed at his base with an aircraft that maintenance crews initially considered beyond repair. Yet Johnson himself was uninjured except for minor cuts from canopy fragments. The incident was captured in gun camera footage from the attacking German fighter, which was later recovered, showing shot after shot hitting the Thunderbolt, without bringing it down, a visual demonstration of survivability that seemed almost impossible to pilots, accustomed to seeing fighters disintegrate under heavy fire. The Germans responded to the Thunderbolt challenge by modifying tactics, upgrading weapons, and attempting to develop fighters that could compete at high altitude, where American escorts were strongest. The Bf-109G received successive engine upgrades throughout 1943 and 1944, pushing horsepower from 1400 to over 1800 through improved supercharging and higher compression ratios. The FW-190 was developed into high-altitude variants with longer wings and turbocharged engines, attempting to match Thunderbolt altitude performance. New heavy armament options, 30mm cannon capable of destroying bombers with single hits, underwing rocket launchers for standoff attacks, were deployed to German fighter units, with instructions to avoid American escorts when possible and concentrate firepower on the bombers themselves. But these were reactive measures, adaptations to an American capability that had fundamentally shifted the air war's strategic balance. The Germans were no longer dictating terms but responding to American initiatives, fighting defensively rather than offensively, bleeding experienced pilots faster than training schools could replace them. The mathematics of attrition warfare played out with brutal clarity in the skies over Germany during 1943 and 1944. The Luftwaffe fighter force lost approximately 10,000 pilots killed or captured during these 2 years, representing virtually the entire experienced pilot corps that had begun the war. German training programs could produce replacement pilots quickly enough to maintain numerical strength, but these replacements averaged 40 to 60 hours of flight time before entering combat, compared to 200 or more hours for American replacement pilots and 400 hours for the veterans they were replacing. The experience differential meant that combat increasingly resembled slaughter rather than battle, with veteran American pilots in superior aircraft destroying inexperienced German pilots who lacked both the training and the aircraft performance to compete effectively. A Luftwaffe instructor, writing in his diary in September 1944, captured the despair. "We send boys into the air to face men, asking them to defeat experienced pilots in better aircraft through courage and devotion to the Reich. This is not tactics but sacrifice, and we are running out of boys to sacrifice." The Thunderbolt's role in the D-Day invasion of June 6, 1944, demonstrated its transformation from high-altitude escort fighter to versatile tactical aircraft capable of supporting ground operations. 18 fighter groups equipped with P-47s provided air cover over the invasion beaches, flying continuous patrols that prevented German aircraft from interfering with the landings. Only 2 German aircraft appeared over the beaches all day: a reconnaissance plane that was immediately shot down and a lone fighter that fled before engaging. But the Thunderbolt's more important contribution came through ground attack missions that destroyed German reinforcements attempting to reach the invasion zone. Pilots flew multiple sorties per day, returning to England to refuel and rearm, before immediately returning to France to attack any German movement they could locate. By late afternoon, June 6th, German armored columns that should have been counter-attacking the beachheads were instead scattered and hiding, their movement paralyzed by constant air attack that destroyed vehicles faster than replacements could arrive. The technique that made the Thunderbolt particularly effective against armored vehicles was dive bombing with high velocity rockets and later with bombs themselves. The high-velocity aircraft rocket, a 5-inch unguided projectile with armor-piercing warhead, could penetrate the top armor of any German tank when striking at the proper angle. Thunderbolt pilots learned to approach tanks from behind at low altitude, pull into a steep climb to gain attacking position, then roll inverted and dive at 60 to 70 degrees, releasing rockets at approximately 1,000 feet before pulling out and escaping at maximum speed. The tactic was hazardously dangerous, diving through anti-aircraft fire with insufficient altitude for error, pulling high G recoveries that sometimes caused pilots to black out, escaping at treetop level where any mechanical failure meant immediate crash. But when executed properly, a single Thunderbolt could destroy multiple tanks in one attack, and a flight of 4 aircraft could devastate an entire armored column in minutes. German tank crews learned to fear the distinctive, the sound of a diving Thunderbolt, rising whistle as the aircraft accelerated downward, the whooshing roar as rockets left their rails, the hammering detonations as warheads struck armor plate more than they feared enemy ground forces. Panzer Commander Otto Carius, whose memoir documented the Eastern and Western Front tank warfare, wrote that his crews would rather face an entire enemy tank battalion than a single flight of American fighter bombers. Against tanks we could maneuver, return fire, use terrain and tactics. Against aircraft diving from above at 500 kilometers per hour, there was no defense except prayer, and prayer was rarely sufficient. The symbolic object that recurred throughout the Thunderbolt story was not the aircraft itself, but the massive radial engine that powered it, that Pratt and Whitney R2800 double wasp that represented American industrial philosophy distilled into 18 cylinders of aluminum and steel. While German engineers pursued efficiency through complexity, designing engines with elaborate fuel injection systems and exotic metallurgy, American engineers pursued reliability through overbuilt simplicity, creating an engine that was almost comically oversized for its application, yet proved virtually indestructible in service. The R2800 could run for hundreds of hours between overhauls, tolerate maintenance by semi-trained mechanics, operate on lower-grade fuel than German engines required, and continue functioning even when damaged by enemy fire. More than 125,000 R2800 engines were produced during the war, powering not just Thunderbolts but also Corsairs and dozens of other aircraft types, becoming the most produced aircraft engine in history and representing the same mass philosophy that characterized all American war material. The engine's sound became distinctive. To anyone who spent time around Thunderbolts, that deep, resonant rumble at idle rising to an ear-splitting roar at full power, 18 cylinders firing in sequence, creating a beat frequency that seemed to shake the air itself. German soldiers learned to identify Thunderbolts by sound alone, distinguishing the R2800's rumble from the higher-pitched scream of German radial engines or the smooth purr of inline engines. The sound meant danger, meant attack was imminent, meant that whatever you were doing needed to stop immediately as you sought cover. Allied soldiers heard the same sound and felt reassurance, knowing that American air power was overhead, that German movement was being interdicted, that the sky belonged to their side. The engine's sound was as much psychological weapon as the guns and rockets the aircraft carried, announcing American presence with unmistakable authority. By 1944, the Thunderbolt had become the most produced American fighter aircraft, with over 15,000 examples built by Republic Aviation's factories in Farmingdale, New York, and Evansville, Indiana. The production rate reached over 1,000 aircraft per month by mid-1944, overwhelming German fighter production, despite the Reich's desperate efforts to maintain output through dispersed factories and underground facilities. More importantly, American factories were producing pilots faster than Germany could kill them, training schools graduating thousands of fighter pilots annually with flight time and instruction that far exceeded what German training could provide. The combination of superior numbers, superior aircraft, and superior training created an air superiority situation that was simply insurmountable through any tactical or technological innovation. Germany could field, by the time the FW-190D and TA-152 entered service in late 1944, aircraft that could match or exceed Thunderbolt performance. They existed in such small numbers and were flown by such inexperienced pilots that their technical advantages were irrelevant to the strategic situation. The Thunderbolt's effectiveness in ground attack led to its primary role shifting from air superiority to close air support by spring 1945, as German fighter opposition diminished to the point where bomber escorts were increasingly unnecessary. Fighter groups that had once escorted bombers deep into Germany now prowled at low altitude across the Reich, attacking any military target they could locate, reducing German ground forces' mobility to near zero during daylight hours. General Dwight Eisenhower credited American fighter bombers, particularly Thunderbolts, with contributing as much to the Allied ground advance as any other single factor, stating in a post-war interview, "Without aerial supremacy, the ground campaign would have been infinitely more costly and possibly unsuccessful. The Germans could not move, could not reinforce, could not even communicate effectively, because our fighters controlled the sky absolutely." The P-47 was perhaps not the most glamorous aircraft, but it was certainly among the most effective weapons we employed. The final tally of Thunderbolt achievements defied the skepticism that had greeted the aircraft when it first appeared. P-47s destroyed approximately 3,900 German aircraft in air-to-air combat, and another 9,000 aircraft destroyed on the ground during strafing attacks. More enemy aircraft destroyed than any other Allied fighter type. They destroyed approximately 86,000 railroad cars, 9,000 locomotives, 6,000 armored vehicles, and 68,000 trucks, effectively interdicting German logistics throughout Western Europe. They flew 546,000 combat sorties, more than any other American fighter, and achieved all this with loss rates significantly lower than lighter, more maneuverable fighters that theoretically should have been superior in combat. The aircraft that had seemed too heavy, too large, too ungainly for fighter operations proved to be exactly what modern air warfare required: a fast, heavy, a survivable platform that could perform multiple roles effectively and could be produced in quantities sufficient to achieve air superiority through overwhelming force. Klaus Becker survived the war, surrendering to American forces in April 1945 after his unit disbanded when fuel exhaustion grounded the Luftwaffe's remaining aircraft. In post-war interviews, he reflected on the Thunderbolt's impact. "We thought the war would be decided by pilot skill and aircraft agility, by the individual combat between fighters where superior training and tactics would prevail. The Americans showed us that such thinking was obsolete. They built fighters that were fast enough to avoid combat when disadvantageous, powerful enough to dictate engagement terms when advantageous, and numerous enough that losses were irrelevant to overall strength. We were fighting 1940s war in 1943 and 1944, and by the time we realized this, the war was already lost." The Thunderbolt represented a different philosophy of air combat that we never fully grasped until it was too late to matter. That philosophy, emphasizing survivability over agility, firepower over finesse, numbers over individual excellence, reflected broader American strategic thinking that valued overwhelming force application rather than elegant solutions. The Thunderbolt was not the best performing fighter in any single metric. It was slower than the P-51 Mustang, less maneuverable than the Spitfire, less heavily armed than the P-38 Lightning's combination of cannon and machine guns, but it combined adequate performance in every relevant metric with exceptional survivability and operational versatility, creating an aircraft that could perform any mission required without being optimized for any particular role. This multi-role capability allowed American commanders to employ Thunderbolts wherever needed without worrying about whether they were using the correct aircraft for the mission, simplifying logistics and maintenance while maximizing operational flexibility. The post-war fate of the Thunderbolt reflected its wartime character: workmanlike service followed by rapid obsolescence, as jet-powered aircraft rendered fighters militarily irrelevant. Most Thunderbolts were scrapped within 5 years of the war's end, their aluminum recycled into post-war products, their engines salvaged for commercial applications or museum display. A few survived as racing aircraft, their powerful engines making them competitive in air races through the 1960s. Others were transferred to air forces in South America and Asia, serving for decades in nations that lacked the industrial capacity to develop indigenous fighters. The Peruvian Air Force operated Thunderbolts until the late 1960s, making it one of the longest-serving fighter aircraft in history, despite being obsolete for most of that service life. The technological legacy of the Thunderbolt extended beyond aviation into broader industrial practices. The manufacturing techniques developed to mass-produce such complex aircraft, systematic quality control, interchangeable components, parallel assembly, processes influenced post-war manufacturing across industries. The R2800 engine's reliability became a benchmark for industrial power plants, influencing design philosophy for commercial aircraft engines, marine propulsion, and stationary power generation. The lessons learned about survivability, design redundant systems, protective armor, structural overbuilding shaped military aircraft development for decades, establishing principles that remain relevant in contemporary combat aircraft design. The human stories behind the Thunderbolt's success reveal that ordinary people who operated extraordinary machines in situations that demanded courage and competence beyond normal experience. Pilots who had been civilian instructors or airline pilots 12 months before found themselves flying combat missions over heavily defended territory. Mechanics who had worked in automobile garages or farm equipment shops learned to maintain radial engines with hundreds of moving parts. Armorers who had been factory workers or store clerks learned to load thousands of rounds of ammunition and install rockets with precision that could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. The democratization of technical competence that this represented the ability to train ordinary people to perform extraordinary tasks through systematic instruction and clear procedures was as much a weapon as the aircraft themselves, allowing America to mobilize its entire population for war production in ways that more stratified societies could not match. The ethical complexities of the Thunderbolt's ground attack role troubled some pilots who recognized that strafing attacks killed not just enemy soldiers but also civilians caught in wrong places or mistaken for military targets. Unlike high-altitude bombing where targets were abstractions marked on maps, low-level attack meant seeing people running, vehicles burning, structures collapsing in immediate and personal detail. Some pilots refused ground attack missions on moral grounds, willing to fight enemy aircraft but unwilling to strafe ground targets, where target identification was uncertain and collateral damage inevitable. Others compartmentalized, accepting ground attack as militarily necessary while acknowledging its moral ambiguity. The official position emphasized that Thunderbolt attacks targeted military assets exclusively, but combat reports and pilot accounts reveal numerous instances where attack criteria were loosely interpreted and anything moving in German-controlled territory became a potential target. The strategic impact of the Thunderbolt on the war's outcome was difficult to quantify precisely but undeniably significant. Without effective escort fighters, the American daylight bombing campaign would have been unsustainable, forcing either abandonment of strategic bombing or shift to night operations where accuracy was minimal. Without fighter bombers interdicting German logistics, the Normandy invasion would have faced more intense armored counterattacks that might have made the beachhead untenable. Without air superiority that Thunderbolts helped establish, German forces could have maneuvered more freely, concentrating forces against Allied advances rather than dispersing to avoid air attack. The counterfactual question, how would the war have unfolded without the Thunderbolt, suggests that the aircraft's contribution extended beyond tactical victories to enable strategic operations that shaped the war's entire trajectory. The final flight of a combat Thunderbolt occurred in August 1955, when a Peruvian Air Force P-47D crashed during a training mission, killing its pilot. The aircraft that had once terrified German tank crews and fighter pilots ended its military career in a remote corner of South America, flown by a pilot who had not been born when the type first entered combat, destroyed not by enemy action but by mechanical failure or pilot error in circumstances that would never be fully investigated. The inglorious end was somehow appropriate for an aircraft that had never been glamorous, never been celebrated in the same way as Spitfires or Mustangs, never captured public imagination, despite being more numerous and arguably more effective than its more famous contemporaries. The Thunderbolt had always been a worker rather than a showpiece, valued for what it did rather than how it looked, remembered by those who flew it and fought against it, but largely forgotten by everyone else. Yet in that utilitarian character lay the aircraft's deepest significance. The Thunderbolt represented industrial warfare's mature form, where victory derived not from individual heroism or tactical brilliance, but from systematic application of superior resources. Through well-designed systems operated by adequately trained personnel, it proved that aerial combat was becoming less about pilot skill and more about equipment capability, that the romantic vision of fighter pilots as knights of the air was obsolete, that modern war rewarded organization and production more than courage and élan. The Germans never expected the P-47 to become a dominant fighter, because they were thinking about air combat in terms that assumed continued relevance of traditional fighter climb rate, maneuverability and turns. What they failed to anticipate was that American engineers would simply bypass these requirements by creating fighters that were fast enough to dictate engagement terms, heavily armed enough to destroy targets in single passes, survivable enough to absorb damage that would destroy traditional designs, and numerous enough that losses were strategically acceptable. The thunder of R2800 engines has faded from European skies, replaced by the screaming roar of jets and later the whisper-quiet efficiency of modern turbofan. The pilots who flew Thunderbolts into combat are nearly all gone now, their generation vanishing as time claims what warfare could not. The aircraft themselves exist only as museum pieces, carefully restored. Their engines occasionally started to demonstrate for audiences who never knew that sound as anything except historical curiosity. But the principles the Thunderbolt embodied remain relevant to contemporary military thinking, that survivability matters as much as performance, that versatility enables options, that specialization that adequate capability produced in overwhelming quantity defeats excellent capability produced in limited numbers, and that industrial capacity, properly mobilized and intelligently applied, remains the foundation upon which military power ultimately rests. The lesson the Germans learned too late was that American abundance was not merely quantitative, but qualitative. The ability to build 15,000 fighters meant each individual fighter could be risked more aggressively, accepted losses that would be catastrophic for smaller air forces, employed tactics that prioritized mission accomplishment over aircraft preservation. A Luftwaffe fighter pilot who lost his aircraft faced weeks or months before receiving a replacement, during which his unit operated under strength, and his accumulated experience remained unused. An American pilot who lost his Thunderbolt typically received a replacement within days, sometimes hours, allowing him to return to combat immediately, with experience intact. This replacement differential meant that American units maintained combat effectiveness despite losses, while German units steadily degraded as attrition exceeded replacement rates. The mathematics were brutal and inescapable. You could not win an attrition contest against an enemy who treated aircraft as expendable resources rather than precious assets. The poetic irony of the Thunderbolt story is that the aircraft succeeded precisely because it violated every assumption about what made fighters effective. It was too heavy, conventional wisdom said, and therefore too slow and unmaneuverable. It was too large, making it an easy target for enemy fighters. It carried too much armament, adding unnecessary weight that degraded performance. Its radial engine created excessive drag compared to sleek inline engines. Every design choice seemed wrong according to traditional fighter doctrine. Yet, in combination, these supposedly inferior choices created an aircraft perfectly suited for the air war that actually developed over Europe in 1943 to 1945. The Germans expected American fighters to follow European design philosophy, emphasizing the characteristics that European combat experience had validated. What they got instead was an aircraft that ignored European lessons in favor of American engineering principles that valued different attributes: power over elegance, survivability over agility, versatility over optimization. The Thunderbolt's transformation from high-altitude escort to low-altitude tank killer represented tactical adaptation that emerged organically from combat experience rather than from strategic planning. The aircraft had not been designed for ground attack, carried no armor-piercing bombs in its original weapon specification, possessed no specialized sighting equipment for ground targets. Yet pilots discovered that the stable gun platform qualities that made it effective against aircraft also made it devastatingly accurate against ground targets, that the heavy armament that could destroy bombers could also destroy locomotives and tanks, that the survivability that allowed it to survive fighter combat also allowed it to survive anti-aircraft fire during strafing runs. The ground attack role emerged because the aircraft's fundamental characteristics, firepower, survivability, abundance, made it suitable for missions its designers never imagined. This adaptability itself represented a kind of superiority, proving that robust engineering created capabilities that extended beyond original specifications. By the war's final year, German soldiers had learned that the distinctive silhouette of a Thunderbolt meant immediate danger regardless of whether they were in aircraft, vehicles, or simply walking along roads. The psychological impact of constant air superiority, knowing that any movement during daylight invited attack, that concentration of forces created targets, that the sky belonged entirely to the enemy, was as corrosive to German military effectiveness as the physical destruction Thunderbolts inflicted. Wehrmacht officers planning operations had to account for the reality that troop movements could only occur at night, that reinforcements might never arrive, that supply convoys existed at the mercy of American fighters who seemed to be everywhere simultaneously. The operational paralysis this created was perhaps the Thunderbolts' greatest contribution. Not the tanks destroyed, or trains wrecked, but the tanks that never moved, and trains that never ran because their operators knew that movement meant destruction. The final accounting of the air war over Europe reveals that the Luftwaffe was defeated, not primarily by being outfought, but by being outproduced. German pilots achieved higher kill ratios throughout most of the war, with experienced pilots routinely destroying multiple American aircraft for each German loss. But the kill ratios were irrelevant when American production replaced losses within days, while German production lagged months behind losses. A Luftwaffe pilot might shoot down 5 American fighters in his career before being killed himself. Seemingly a favorable exchange ratio, but if those 5 fighters were replaced within a week, while he took 6 months to replace, the exchange favored the Americans despite the seemingly inferior performance. The Thunderbolt embodied this strategic reality. Individual aircraft might be lost in combat, but the collective strength of Thunderbolt-equipped units grew continuously throughout 1943 to 1945, even as German fighter strength contracted despite desperate efforts to maintain numerical parity. The transformation of the European air war from contested battle space in 1943 to American-dominated environment in 1945 occurred with remarkable speed once the tipping point was reached. In January 1943, German fighters destroyed bombers with impunity during missions beyond escort range. By January 1944, German fighters faced escorts throughout most of their defensive zone and suffered unsustainable losses when attempting bomber interception. By January 1945, German fighters had largely abandoned daylight operations, conceding air superiority entirely and attempting night operations where Allied technological advantages were less decisive. The Thunderbolt was not solely responsible for this transformation. Improved tactics, additional escort types, pilot training, and German resource depletion all contributed, but it was the essential enabler that made everything else possible. Without Thunderbolts escorting bombers deep into Germany, the daylight bombing campaign would have failed. Without that failure, the entire strategic calculus of the Western War might have shifted toward different approaches with uncertain outcomes. The soldiers who watched Thunderbolts overhead, both German and American, understood viscerally what strategic analysts would later calculate mathematically: that air power had become the dominant factor in ground warfare, that forces without air superiority were vulnerable regardless of numerical or tactical advantages, that the side controlling the sky effectively controlled the battlefield. This represented a revolutionary change in military affairs, shifting emphasis from ground combat, which had dominated warfare for millennia, to aerial combat that could interdirect logistics, isolates battlefields, and directly attack ground forces with minimal risk to the attackers. The Thunderbolt was the instrument through which this revolution manifested over Western Europe, the physical embodiment of air power's mature form applied to defeat an enemy that still thought in terms of ground warfare primacy. The engine's roar that had once signaled danger to German forces eventually became historical memory. preserved in recordings and remembered by dwindling numbers of veterans who had heard it in combat. But the principles that engine represented: overwhelming power applied through robust engineering, reliability through overbuilt design, versatility through fundamental capability rather than specialized optimization. These principles persisted into post-war military development and remain relevant in contemporary systems. The philosophy that created the R2800 engine, creating the Thunderbolt, influenced jet engine development, helicopter power plant design, naval propulsion, and countless civilian applications where reliability matters more than theoretical efficiency. The legacy was not primarily the aircraft itself, but the approach to engineering problems that the aircraft exemplified. The cost of the Thunderbolt program was approximately $5.6 billion in 1940s dollars for 15,686 aircraft produced, representing roughly $360,000 per aircraft, expensive by contemporary standards, but cheap compared to bomber costs and trivial compared to the strategic value delivered. Each Thunderbolt destroyed multiple times its cost in enemy equipment during operational service, achieved objectives that ground forces could not accomplish without prohibitive casualties, and contributed to ending the war months or years earlier than would have been possible without air superiority. The return on investment, calculated purely in military economic terms, was extraordinary. Calculated in lives saved through shortened war duration and reduced combat casualties, the value becomes incalculable. The final flight of many Thunderbolts came not in combat but in the scrapyards, where thousands were cut apart for aluminum recovery in the years immediately following the war. The metal that had once formed fighters was transformed into civilian products: automobiles, building materials, consumer goods, the swords, beaten into plowshares through industrial recycling that made no distinction between weapons and raw materials. This prosaic ending lacked drama or ceremony, but it reflected the aircraft's essential nature as industrial product rather than artistic creation. Thunderbolts were built to be used and used hard, with no expectation of preservation or historical significance. That a few survived was almost accidental, preserved by enthusiasts and museums who recognized that future generations might want physical connection to the aircraft. That it helped decide history's greatest conflict, or the German expectation that American fighters would follow European patterns: lightweight, agile, optimized for dogfighting, was reasonable given that every successful fighter to that point had embodied these characteristics. What the Germans failed to anticipate was that American engineers, less constrained by tradition and more willing to experiment with unconventional approaches, would create fighters that succeeded through different virtues. The Thunderbolt proved that there were multiple paths to air superiority, that European tactical doctrine was not universal truth, but localized wisdom that American circumstances could render obsolete. The shock of this realization that American aircraft didn't have to be better versions of European fighters, but could be fundamentally different types that succeeded through alternative approaches, came too late for Germany to respond effectively. By the time German engineers began developing fighters specifically designed to counter Thunderbolt advantages, the war was already lost and industrial capacity no longer existed to produce new designs in meaningful numbers. The symbolic weight of the Thunderbolt extended beyond its combat record to represent American industrial democracy's triumph over authoritarian militarism. The aircraft was designed by civilian engineers working for a private corporation, produced by factory workers who were free to change jobs if unsatisfied, paid for through democratically appropriated funds that required congressional approval. Every aspect of its creation involved voluntary cooperation rather than coerced participation, market mechanisms rather than command allocation, transparent processes rather than hidden decisions. That such a system could produce superior military equipment, faster and in greater quantity than authoritarian alternatives was unexpected by observers who assumed that dictatorships' efficiency advantages would extend to military production. The Thunderbolt proved otherwise, demonstrating that free people working voluntarily could outproduce coerced labor working under threat, that market mechanisms could allocate resources more efficiently than command planning, that democracy's messy processes created better outcomes than authoritarianism's apparent order. The thunder has faded, the engine silent, the pilots gone, the aircraft themselves mostly vanished except for carefully preserved museum pieces that bear little resemblance to the oil-stained, battle-damaged machines that fought over Europe 8 decades ago. What remains is the lesson, sometimes forgotten but never truly lost, that abundance defeats scarcity in conflicts of sufficient duration, that industrial capacity matters more than individual capability when war becomes total, that the nation that can produce more adequate weapons will defeat the nation that produces fewer excellent weapons. The Germans never expected a 7-ton fighter to dominate aerial combat because they were thinking about individual aircraft performance rather than systemic capability, tactical advantages rather than strategic resources, the battle rather than the war. The Thunderbolt taught them otherwise. One sortie at a time, one destroyed target at a time, one inexorable demonstration after another that the mathematics of industrial warfare favored the side that could sustain losses, replace equipment, and continue operations regardless of tactical setbacks. The P-47 Thunderbolt was never the most beloved fighter among pilots who flew it, never captured public imagination the way Spitfires or Mustangs did, never achieved the aesthetic grace that makes some aircraft timeless beyond their military function. It was a brute, a monster, a sledgehammer where others were rapiers, but sledgehammers break down doors that rapiers merely scratch, and the Thunderbolt broke down the door that separated Allied ground forces from Berlin, that kept Allied bombers from striking German industry with impunity, that protected German armies from air attack that would make their ground operations untenable. In the final accounting, elegance matters less than effectiveness, beauty less than function, reputation less than results. The Thunderbolt delivered results, devastating, undeniable, war-winning results, and in doing so proved that American engineering philosophy, American industrial capacity, and American strategic thinking could defeat the most experienced air force in the world, not through superior individual skill but through superior systematic application of overwhelming material advantage. The Germans never expected it, because they were not prepared to imagine that their assumptions about air warfare could be so completely wrong. The thunder of that realization, more than the thunder of R2800 engines, echoed through the remainder of the war and into the post-war world where American air power would define military capability for generations yet to come.